Pick up a pen right now. Write your name. Just your name, the way you always write it. Don't think about it. Don't try to make it neat. Just write it the way your hand naturally does it when nobody is watching. What you just produced is not just a signature. It is a neurological fingerprint, a real-time readout of the state of your nervous system, your emotional regulation, the pressure you are carrying, and in some cases, the first visible signal of something changing inside your brain long before any other symptom appears. This is not handwriting analysis as parlor trick. This is graphotherapy, and the science behind it is stranger, older, and more rigorous than most people expect. To understand why your handwriting reveals so much, you have to understand what is actually happening when you write by hand. Most people think of handwriting as a motor skill. You learned it as a child. Your hand moves. Letters appear. But the process is far more complex than that. Neuroscientist Stanislas Dehaene at the Collège de France has spent decades studying how the brain processes written language, and one of his core findings is that handwriting is not a single action. It is a symphony. The visual cortex, the motor cortex, the cerebellum, the prefrontal cortex, and areas associated with language, memory, and emotion all activate simultaneously when you write by hand. Nothing else you do with your hand comes close to recruiting this many brain regions at once. And because so many systems are involved, handwriting is exquisitely sensitive to the state of all of them. Think about what happens to your handwriting when you're anxious. The pressure increases. The strokes become more erratic. Letters that you normally form smoothly begin to show microtremors, tiny vibrations in the line that reflect the state of your nervous system. Think about what happens when you're exhausted. The baseline of your writing drifts. Letters shrink. The spaces between words become uneven. Think about what happens when you're deeply happy or in a state of flow. The writing opens up. The letters lift slightly from the baseline. The overall rhythm becomes more consistent. None of this is interpretation. These are measurable physical changes in the marks you leave on paper, and they map directly onto documented neurological and psychological states. Psychiatrist Rhoda Wander spent years studying the relationship between handwriting characteristics and mood disorders, and what she found was that people with clinical depression showed consistent and measurable changes in their handwriting compared to their non-depressed baseline. Letters became smaller, a phenomenon called micrographia. Writing slowed significantly. The pressure on the page lightened. The baseline, the invisible line the letters sit on, became irregular and often descended across the page. These were not stylistic choices. They were physical symptoms of a brain state, manifesting in ink. And it gets more specific than mood. Neurologist June Tan at the National University of Singapore has documented how certain neurological conditions produce distinctive handwriting signatures years before formal diagnosis. Parkinson's disease, for example, produces a very specific pattern of micrographia combined with tremor and inconsistent letter sizing. Alzheimer's disease shows a different pattern entirely, with increasing simplification of letter forms, loss of the complex loops and connections that characterize mature handwriting, and gradual breakdown in the spatial organization of the writing on the page. These changes can appear in handwriting samples up to a decade before the person or their family notices anything wrong. Your handwriting, in other words, may be keeping a record that you are not consciously aware of. But graphotherapy is not only about reading the signals. It is about using the signals to intervene. And this is where it gets genuinely fascinating. If handwriting reflects the state of the brain, then deliberately changing the handwriting can, over time, begin to influence the brain state it reflects. This is the core hypothesis of graphotherapy as a clinical practice, and the mechanism behind it is neuroplasticity. Here is the logic. The neural pathways that produce a given handwriting style are deeply habitual. They are grooves worn into the motor cortex by years of repetition. But the brain is plastic. It rewires in response to sustained new patterns of input. If you deliberately practice writing with a more open, upright, expansive style, the physical act of producing those different motor patterns sends different signals through the network of brain regions involved in writing. Over weeks and months of consistent practice, this can begin to shift the neural baseline. French graphologist and therapist Ania Teillard, who worked in the early 20th century, was among the first practitioners to formalize this as a clinical approach. She documented cases where patients who deliberately changed specific features of their handwriting, the pressure they used, the slant of their letters, the size of their capitals, reported measurable changes in their emotional experience over time. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually and consistently. The skeptic in you is probably already raising a hand. Is this cause and effect, or just correlation? Does changing your handwriting actually change your brain, or does it just feel meaningful? The honest answer is that the research is still developing. But there are several threads of evidence that make the mechanism plausible. First, the well-documented phenomenon of embodied cognition, the finding that physical posture, facial expression, and movement patterns influence mental states, not just the other way around. Research by social psychologist Amy Cuddy at Harvard showed that adopting expansive physical postures produced measurable changes in cortisol and testosterone levels. If posture can shift hormones, the finely tuned motor patterns of handwriting may have similar downstream effects. Second, there is the specific finding, documented across multiple studies, that writing by hand about emotional experiences produces measurable psychological and even physical health benefits. Psychologist James Pennebaker at the University of Texas at Austin spent decades studying this and found that people who wrote by hand about their deepest emotional experiences showed improved immune function, fewer visits to doctors, better academic performance, and lower rates of depression and anxiety compared to control groups. The act of transforming internal experience into physical marks on a page appears to do something that typing does not replicate. Pennebaker's hypothesis was that handwriting forces a different kind of cognitive processing. The slower speed of the hand relative to thought requires the writer to compress, select, and organize in real time. This active compression is itself a form of emotional processing that the brain finds regulating. Third, and perhaps most striking, is the emerging research on handwriting and childhood development. Studies comparing children who learn to write by hand versus those who learn primarily through keyboards have found consistent differences in brain activation patterns, reading comprehension, letter recognition, and even emotional processing. The handwriters show more robust engagement of the neural networks associated with learning and memory. The physical act of forming a letter by hand, with all its imperfect pressure and direction and weight, recruits the brain in a way that pressing a key does not. Which brings you back to the name you wrote at the beginning of this. Look at it, not at what it looks like, at how you wrote it. Was the pressure heavy or light? Did the letters lean forward or backward or stand straight? Did you lift the pen between strokes, or did you connect everything in one continuous motion? Did the writing get smaller or larger as you went? Did it stay on the baseline or drift? Every one of these features is a data point, not a verdict, not a diagnosis, but a signal about the state of the system that produced it. A nervous system that is calm writes differently than one that is on edge. A mind that is contracted writes differently than one that is open. A person carrying something heavy writes differently than a person who has recently put something down. The pen knows things your words don't say. And the most unsettling and quietly hopeful implication of graphotherapy is this: you have been leaving this record everywhere. Every note, every grocery list, every card you have ever signed, every signature on every form, every page of every journal you have ever kept. You have been writing your nervous system onto paper your whole life. You just didn't know anyone could read it. The question now is whether you want to use what you know about the connection to begin writing something different.